Dr. Nicola Poloni, welcome to Cordoba. I would like to ask you some questions on your field of study. First, do you think that Middle Ages can be taken as a fine example for those studying the transmission of knowledge? If so, in what sense?
Well, thank you very much for this question and also for having me here today. I believe it is an important question indeed, the one that you're asking. Transmission of knowledge is one of the defining factors for the Latin Middle Ages and in general for the Middle Ages in this part of the world, the Mediterranean basin, and then the communities that were living on its shores during the Middle Ages and were speaking different languages, practicing different religions, having different cultures. So, for instance, we have, as you know very well, in Europe, the most important, at least in terms of numbers of people in the continent at the time, a community that was speaking Latin. Then you have, of course, the Byzantine Empire, speaking Greek, and this part of Europe, Al-Andalus, where Arabic was the main language, even though, of course, you also had Hebrew. So if we just were to consider the European part of the Mediterranean basin, you can see how language was fundamental and the transmission of knowledge, the cross-cultural, cross-linguistic transmission of knowledge that accompanied this communities is really the most important and defining feature of the Middle Ages. Then if from there we would like to expand our view, as we should, to what is beyond the Mediterranean basin, of course, while we have this idea, this stereotype of the Middle Ages as an era of darkness, the Dark Ages, well, I believe that it's our line of work that demonstrated actually it was perhaps the other way around. So you have many other venues, many other places in the world, for instance, China, in which, of course, during the many centuries that are included in what we call the Middle Ages, well, they had the same amount of cross-cultural and cross-linguistic transfer of knowledge, and this is, again, a defining feature. And again, if we were to look at India, for instance, that would be the very same thing again. So yes, just to reply to your question, yes, it is a very important feature, transmission of knowledge in the Middle Ages, not only in Europe or the Mediterranean basin, but worldwide. But then I should ask you a question back. Is it possible for it to be different? Can there be a sort of real development of new knowledge without a dialogue, without a transmission of knowledge from different settings, different experiences, different ways?
Of course not. Of course not. No, I'm agree with you. I think you because you are expanding the scope very well. Yes, thank you. But I would like you something more particular. Could be Al-Andalus, since you have mentioned, a good example for the study of that phenomenon, I mean, transmission of knowledge?
Yeah, of course. I mean, Al-Andalus is one of the most eminent examples of transmission of knowledge in general, not just in the Middle Ages. Just a few days ago, I was watching a YouTube video, and yes, you can find very nice videos on YouTube, very informative, and especially, I believe they are important for us as experts, but experts living in this ivory tower. They're very important for us to understand how these contents that we are discussing can be vehiculated to the broader audience, to people, because eventually, if someone wants to know more about something, we probably watch a video on YouTube first, and then after many videos, decide to enroll or join a university. So, and then there was this nice video, as I was saying, the person commenting on it was saying that indeed Al-Andalus is the best counterexample to what I was mentioning earlier the stereotype of the Middle Ages as an age of darkness, of aggressions, and all this. Of course, Al-Andalus was home to different communities, different religious communities, different linguistic communities, and they were in contact constantly. They were trying to build something different. And without any exaggeration, it is so fantastic what they achieved. Think of philosophy, think of astronomy, think of literature. All these topics were possible, or these developments, these huge developments of these disciplines were possible only, in my opinion, because it was a tolerant, open-minded framework in place. And so that's why Al-Andalus is so important. Then, of course, if you think of, well, towns that were in Al-Andalus for a few centuries, but then not for so long, for instance, Toledo. Toledo is an example of how all this can be translated into something else. So as you know, Toledo became one of the main venues for the translation, the so-called translation movement. And that is another example of what Andalus meant and still means for the whole of Europe. Since thanks to that translation movement, a huge deal of texts were translated from Arabic into Latin, and a lot of them were produced by Andalusian philosophers, like Averroes, for instance. And the impact of Averroes on our culture, our Western, if you want, Christian culture, is still to be explored. We know how important it has been. I don't believe we still have a real, well-grounded appreciation of Averroes' role in the formation of our culture.
Right. And what roles, in general, did the translations play in the transmission and exchange of knowledge, in your opinion?
Well, translation is transmission of knowledge. I don't want to philosophize too much here, but of course, what is a translation? Translation is the transmission of a content, of an idea, whatever, of a piece of language that I speak or write, translated into another language, yet translated into another scheme of interpretation. So if we can maybe even say that translation and interpretation are synonyms, because also for you there is a sort of translation. Even if we were speaking the same language as native speakers, there would be yet a level of translation. So translation, in a way, philosophically, we could even say that is a sort of mover, an incubator at the very least, of philosophical ideas. In the Middle Ages, regarding this translation movement, if we want to accept this label, well, I mean, the role has been fundamental, because, I mean, maybe we shouldn't follow or believe too closely to what the translators themselves in the 12th century, 11th century were saying about the reasons why they were translating, because, of course, there is also a degree of rhetorical exaggeration in these things, and they depict a state of affairs in this continent that was deprimant at the very least. So they had no books, they had no knowledge, and then they say we had to move, like Gerard of Cremona, we had to move to look for, it can be Ptolemy's Almagest or any other of those important books to rejuvenate, if you will, the culture made in Latin Europe at the time. So yeah, that can be an exaggeration. For sure, the impact has been fundamental. If you think of scholasticism or even universities as institutions, I mean, could there be a university like the University of Paris, or a debate like the debates that we had in the 13th, 15th, even 16th or 17th centuries about Aristotelianism without the translations of Aristotle? And here I include both the Arabic and the Greek translations of Aristotle, evidently. But yet, okay, even if we had Aristotle, would the interpretation of Aristotle that defined scholasticism would it have been the same without the translation of Avicenna, without the translation of Averroes? No. But that, of course, is a material level on which we can agree, all of us, I believe. There is something more, because, again, as I was saying, interpretation and translation are synonyms. So every translation is a reinterpretation of the original text.
I agree with you.
And this is fascinating. Think, for instance, of Solomon in Gabriel's Fons Vitae. It's a text. Unfortunately, we don't have the Arabic original of this text, but the Latin translation made by Gondicelinus in Toledo, apparently following Sarah Pessin's very well-grounded remarks and analysis of the text, well, this Latin translation apparently reshapes completely the meaning, the general and specific meaning of that text. And so what happens? From a Neoplatonic text, you have an Aristotelianized version of the text that is interpreted through the lenses of Aristotle and then received, creating a huge amount of problems, like, for instance, the doctrine of a plurality of substantial forms or universal isomorphism, problems and doctrines that would have never existed, quite probably, if the text were not translated into Latin, because they are not there in those terms in their Arabic original. So, again, incubators of ideas, translations, incubators of philosophy and spreaders of philosophy. This is what translations are. They were just a few examples, but again, the Aristotelianization of the translated text, like in the case of Gabriel, and on the other hand, the role that this translation played in order to build a way, the Latin way, the scholastic way of doing philosophy, that again shaped so much for so many centuries, getting as far as China with the Jesuits in China, and as far as Latin America, New Spain, and then all the other viceroyalties of Spain in Latin America for centuries.
If we think of Middle Ages intellectual projection, which field of studies, if any, becomes more influential later on, say early modern period?
Well, this is a difficult question, a very, very difficult question, actually. So first, we should decide what do we mean with Middle Ages and medieval philosophy. But let's start with the Middle Ages. So we can say that the Middle Ages are a period of time that starts more or less the 5th century and ends when? I mean, it's not a big issue, perhaps, not in this case, at least following your question, when it starts, but it is when it ends. Because, for instance, Renaissance philosophy it was something geographically limited to a region of Europe. So I wouldn't go by saying that medieval philosophy and the Middle Ages ends with the Renaissance, especially when we discuss philosophy, because philosophy, medieval philosophy, if there is anything called medieval philosophy, in its later parts, is scholastic philosophy. So how can we just stop and say, well, Francisco Suarez is not a scholastic philosopher. He is perhaps the best scholastic philosophers we have, and it is not in the Middle Ages. Yeah, I mean, because maybe our label, the Middle Ages and medieval philosophy, just doesn't work.
It's wrong.
We should follow traditions instead of periods.
Right.
So we should talk about scholasticism, for instance, and then see that if scholasticism is one of the main features of medieval philosophy, then I would say that medieval philosophy takes for sure all of the 16th century, and perhaps in the peripheries, if we want to have peripheries and centers, which make sense, like again, New Spain or China with Jesuits in China or Japan, then in those peripheries, yeah, scholasticism goes on also for a big part of the 17th century, and in Latin America, so both the Spanish and Portuguese parts, also in the 18th century. Do we want to have a Middle Ages that gets to the 18th century, perhaps we don't want. Perhaps we want a different way to refer to this period and this part of philosophy. So if we had to go back to the narrative in which the Middle Ages ends with you can pick one, the fall of Constantinople, the discovery of America, or the take of Granada, which is like the same year of the discovery of America, so it's not a big issue. Yeah, if we want to stick to that narrative, I would say that, yeah, I mean, there are many disciplines that impacted on the later tradition. Sciences, of course, you have continuities and ruptures all over the place. I work mostly on alomorphism, so the theory that everything, the Aristotelian theory that basically all bodies, let's try to simplify without making mistakes, are made of matter and form. Then alomorphism, for instance, continues for centuries, impacting on science and philosophy, metaphysics, natural philosophy alike. And of course, you start to have more and more criticism against this theory up to the 17th century, when you have Robert Boyle or Descartes, Francis Bacon. Yet, once again, we have the same problem, because in Latin America, they continue to accept and develop alomorphism for decades and decades. So what is philosophy? If I started by questioning what are the Middle Ages? So what is philosophy? Because if philosophy is, in the history of philosophy, is a history of originality, then we have probably something different. But if philosophy is the history of our meta-reflection on ourselves as human beings and our interpretation of reality, then there should be no center, no peripheries. And we should just consider that, of course, there were some people that were producing something new, something very valuable, I would say, if we think of Galileo Newton, but yet there are also other ways in which these theories from the Middle Ages, they stick there. Think of matter and form, again, alomorphism. We can go and talk to anyone out there, someone passing through, and ask, what do you think? What is the matter of this thing here, of this tree? And they would understand what is its form. And they would understand because, of course, some notions that were developed broadly during the Middle Ages, they stick with us. They're still here. And they form part of our common sense interpretation of reality. So you have this dimension. You have, of course, metaphysics. And metaphysics, here you have a huge revolution with René Descartes. But then, I mean, even with Descartes, you have some continuity, some aspects of scholasticism continues there. And you get, in another way, through Suarez, up to Christian Wolff. And then, I mean, Kant is already looming there.
Yes, that's right.
So, and then, I mean, this is philosophy, then you have science, and then, I mean, sorry if I have to limit myself to a critical discussion, replay. But yes, we should problematize, challenge the labels we received during our own education and find new ways, different ways, more open, I would say, and global ways to tackle this problem. Also because, again, sorry for going back to this point, but we cannot use the Middle Ages or medieval as a term that is valid worldwide. And we live in a globalized world. And philosophy, in its aim to be something valuable for all human beings, needs to be a global philosophy. And the history of philosophy needs to be a global history of philosophy. In a global history of philosophy, there is no room for something called medieval philosophy or the Middle Ages. We have to really rethink the labels, rethink the way we do history of philosophy, and the structures we deploy when we do that.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Poloni. Thank you.
Thank you.